What is the system that you use in sermon preparation and delivery? Every preacher needs to have a system that helps to guide them in advancing their craft. I use a system, and I will share it with you. I am not a New England Patriots fan, but I admire the fact that they had a system that worked for them for many years. Across 20 years, Bill Belichick, the head coach, and quarterback Tom Brady ran what is called a flair control offense that led them to 6 Super Bowls. Now, when he coached the Chicago Bulls, Phil Jackson implemented what was known as the triangle offense. The result, we all know, they netted 6 NBA championships. Some would argue that the system was Michael Jordan, but we will leave that for another time. In soccer, Pep Guardiola has had significant success with Barcelona, Bayern Munich, and Manchester City due to the system he implemented of unselfish touch and pass football or soccer. Having a system is very, very important. Having a template can be very helpful at times to accomplish what you need to do in a shorter period of time than you would normally have done it without a system. Having a system or a template is significant to simplify what would be otherwise an arduous process. Well, with preaching, it is no different. I use a 4-part system to help me, especially when I'm doing expository preaching. But this system can be used for any style of preaching. The first level of the system structure that I use is to state the point. In one previous video, I shared with you about finding the big idea for the sermon. The big idea is shared in one sentence that summarizes the central argument or theme. To clarify the big idea, I try to divide the sermon into smaller portions. This helps me to expound clearly so that the sermon is memorable. Now, these smaller portions will have headings that I call the points of emphasis, and these are the points that I'm speaking about. It may be 2 or 3 or 4, and when I transition from my introduction to these points, I may say something like, and the occasion and the outcome of this story leads us to 3 points or 4 points or 5 points to contemplate. Then I go into the first point. So now what I do is I simply state the point. I'm saying something like this. Point number 1 is, or the first point is, or this narrative is tailored to teach in the first place, or I may even go back to that transitional statement that I used earlier to say, the first thing that the occasion and the outcome of this story leads me to is, or the first point from the occasion and the outcome of this story is. That is what I call stating the point. The second level of the system structure is to explain the point. Now, after I state the point, then I seek to explain the point. I expound on that point. Now, first, I suggest you point to the place in the text or the narrative or the story where the point is derived, so that when you're explaining the point, you are not losing your listeners. You are taking them with you. You ensure that the listeners see the point as coming from the text. Now, here is something that you should never forget. If you're doing an expository sermon with a primary text of emphasis, your points must be derived from the text. If you're doing a topical sermon, this may be different, but if you are preaching an expository sermon, your points, your main points must come from the text that you are preaching from, the main text. You cannot have your main ideas, your main points coming from a subsidiary text if you're preaching an expository sermon. Now, when you point to the place where the point is derived, then you share the justification for how you came to that conclusion. And this is where you will share the information and the study and the scholarship, the schools of thought, the cross-reference or the substantiating quotations and the supporting arguments. This is where you are explaining the point. Now hear this. A simple way to explain the point without losing your audience is to share the questions you are answering. In so doing, you will easily invite, or rather, you will take the listeners into that process that you are using to discover or to study or to do your exegesis. And this will also enhance their engagement, because now you're not just giving them information, but they are walking with you as you lead them to the answers to the questions that you have raised in your mind. Now, this also helps to highlight and heighten the tension for the point that you are explaining, because you want for your congregation to be so engaged that the tension, the issue, the matter that you are dealing with, they are right there with you. And when you have altogether resolved the issue, then you, as the preacher, you confidently and convincingly answer the question in the simplest way possible. Now, I must let you know that one of the things you must consider doing when you are explaining the point is the use of repetition to help the listeners get what you're saying with other words. So you will say things like, in other words, or you may say, that is to say, or you may restate by saying, let me restate that, or you may want to rephrase, and you can say that, let me rephrase that. There are several ways to repeat the explanation of the point with short phrases so that it is clearly understood. Now, some preachers have some colorful ways to say this, like, let me put this where you can catch it, or let me put this, I like to say this, put this on the lower shelf, or you may want to say simply put. But what you're doing here is basically explaining the point. You are allowing them to see where point number one goes, where it begins and where it ends. The third level of the system structure is to illustrate the point. Sometimes it is necessary to illuminate or to elucidate the point further. The use of an experience or a story may help to make the point clearer. It must be observed, though, that the illustration is not an end in itself. The illustration is to solidify the point that you are making. And this means that when you are through with the illustration, the point must be seen clearer. The illustration must not lead away from the point, but must zero in on the point. I've heard several illustrations used in sermons that confused me to the point where I ask, what was he or she trying to say? If you feel that you must explain your illustration, then you should know that that illustration did not serve the purpose for which you used it. Your illustration must be making the point clearer. The final level of the system structure that I want to present to you is to apply the point. So we have already dealt with stating the point, explaining the point, illustrating the point. Now we apply the point. A sermon without relevant application is not a sermon. The purpose of the sermon is to allow the listeners to see the correlation between the scripture and their lives. Ultimately, when the listeners hear the sermon, they will be asking or should be asking the questions, in light of all this information that I am receiving, in light of this information that the preacher is sharing, how does God want me to obey? How does God want me to follow? How does God want me to trust Him? How does this apply to my life? How can I implement this to my life? How can I employ these principles to my particular situation? As preachers, we have a responsibility to answer these questions. Now, here is how the system works. If at the outset in your studies you identified 3 main points that you intend to focus on, when you are writing the sermon and subsequently preaching the sermon, you should spend the time to state each point, explain each point, illustrate each point, and apply each point. So if you have 3 points, then you will do this for all 3. When you have done this, the system will work well. I hope this video will help to encourage your progress in preparation and presentation of the Word of God. If you have another system that works well for you, I'd be more than happy if you would share it in the comment section so that I can learn from you. Also, please like and share this video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe now, and you will be notified when I upload subsequent videos. May God continue to bless you as you proclaim Him through preaching.